Hi friends and welcome back. I'm so excited about our next journey together. So for this series or segment, whatever, we're going to look at different political and economic theories. And as always, my goal is to make the information easier to understand because trust me, some of this is pretty difficult. And as always, if you have questions or comments, put them in the comments. Yeah, weird. Down below. So let's go learn some cool things. So, like I said last week, we're still doing State and Revolution. Still in chapter 1, we're going to move on to part 2. So, luckily for us, the title to section 2 is much easier to understand. It is Special Bodies of Armed Men, Prisons, etc. That's pretty straightforward, I think. Lenin opens again with a quote from Engels. So, let's read that quote and then analyze what it means. So, as against the ancient gentle organization, the primary distinguishing feature of the state is the division of the subjects of the state according to territory. So this section actually really relates well to the video we did about preventing violence by James Gilligan. So if you haven't watched that, I highly recommend go back and check out that video. I'll link it here, whichever side the little linky thing comes on, or just read the book. It's one of my favorites. So, back to that quote from Engels, it's like how we have states and counties and cities, and those become part of your identity. So like me, I'm from New England and I highly identify as a New Englander. I will definitely fight you over it. So Lenin explains that while this seems normal to us because it's what we've always known, it's not always been the case for previous human civilizations. Things are not now as they have always been. So again, back to Engels, who also explains that the state is established as what he refers to as a public power, which is not reflective of the general population, but becomes necessary with the separation of the people into the classes. So remember, those classes are the bourgeoisie or the ruling class and the proletariat, the working class. We are the proletariat, we do the work. So that public power, which is the state, includes the armed men, so the police and the military, as well as their coercive institutions, so things like the courts, official laws. The state has a monopoly on violence, so they can use violence in whatever way they deem appropriate, but as soon as you resort to violence, you are labeled a criminal. Also, prisons, which are some of the most violent places in the country, again, back to that Preventing Violence by James Gilligan, but they're not violent because we fill them with violent criminals, but because the violence employed against inmates becomes learned behavior. In that book, Gilligan talks about the fastest way to create violent criminals is to send someone to jail. So Lenin and Engels point out that, again, human civilization has not always had this kind of organization or social structures. So we did not always use violence to scare people away from being violent, which is a paradox in and of itself. We know full well that that does not work. Our increasingly violent police forces have only increased violence across the country. So ask yourself, like, why do you think that we hold on to this belief when we know that it isn't working? So Lenin then explores the idea of whether things are the way they are now because that's just the way it has to be, or some other reason. Yeah. So he explains that the living memory of people is pretty short. So during the time of the writing of State and Revolution, they had not witnessed a great revolution. So then in their minds, it couldn't be any other way. So I would say that we're at that, like, a similar place again. Like, I think it's very challenging for most people to visualize what a revolution would look like or what happens after that. And not knowing those things can make it really scary. So Lenin states that even at the time of publication, so again, remember this is around like 100 years ago, people would use the excuse of things like the complexity of social life or the separating of people into groups for different purposes. While those seem scientific, they completely ignore the fact that they've been divided into those two opposing classes. So I would also add, as Lenin mentioned earlier, that the further division into our respective territories makes it even more challenging to identify one's oppressor or your enemy or whatever you would like to call them, because you've internalized like where you're from. So I am obviously a New Englander, I'm an American, and so then when you meet somebody else and they're like, oh, I'm Iranian, like we already have this ingrained division between us. And obviously it's not as stark when we're talking about states, but someone from the South can hold or have like personal characteristics that they identify with that contrast someone from, say, like California. Like we do have these stigmas just associated with where you live or where you're from within the United States, not even talking globally. So with the way that we have been taught to believe that the police and the military serve us, the working class, it's difficult to imagine what an armed population looks like. So we view those arms of the state as our defense, and we don't always consider that it may be them that we need to defend ourselves from. So if we, as the working class, were to take up arms, Lenin explains that it would 100% result in an armed conflict between the classes. That is one of the biggest differences we see here between a leftist and a liberal. A liberal is like a big advocate of gun control and regulation, whereas a leftist says you cannot take away, just as Marx said, you cannot take away the weapons from the working class. And if they try to do that, Marx says that you can use violence to stop it. But so a leftist understands that the working class needs to be armed, whereas a liberal firmly believes in this idea of gun control, in that police and the military should be the only entities allowed to use violence. Yeah, that's it. Allowed to use violence. I even put that quote in here. So this is the exact quote from Marx, and it says, "Under no pretext should arms and ammunition be surrendered. Any attempt to disarm the worker must be frustrated by force if necessary." In your opinion, is that what freedom looks like to you? Do you believe that if the working class were to take up arms, that the only result would be an armed conflict between the state and the working class? And if so, what does that mean about the state and the working class? Like, what does that mean that their relationship is, if one of them is afraid of the other one being able to defend itself? Okay, so Engels goes on to state that the power of the... I probably could have worded that differently. So Engels goes on to state that the power of the state increases as the gap between the two classes increases. So, and again, let's take a second to think about that. Do you think that that is what is happening in the US right now? Lenin goes on to explain that the entire world, even at the time in history that this was being written, is being divided up by imperialist conquest. So 100 years later, these are still things that are happening today. So American imperialism, which is where we go out or into other countries and install either government or government officials that align with our goals for global conquest, and that is still happening today right now. So we deny the reality of these rivalries and conquests between the developed nations using words like national defense. So when there's nothing that we're defending against, what they're defending is the status quo and their power, and they're doing that with our bodies, not theirs. So again, what does that say about the dynamic of the ruling class and the working class? So what do you think? I know, again, this is a lot to like dismantle or to think about or to really process, especially in contrast to the nationalistic, anti-communist, anti-socialist indoctrination that we receive in public schools here in the United States. But when you take a second and think about it for yourself, like, what do you think? Like, do you think I missed anything? Do you have any other interpretations? Do you have something to add? Definitely let us know in the comments. Otherwise, go forth and do good things. And I will see you whenever we get to the next part. Thanks for hanging in there.